What's up, everybody? My name is Demetri Kofinas, and you're listening to Hidden Forces, a podcast that inspires investors, entrepreneurs, and everyday citizens to challenge consensus narratives and learn how to think critically about the systems of power shaping our world. My guest in this episode of Hidden Forces is Nick Bostrom, the founding director of the Future of Humanity Institute and principal researcher at the Macrostrategy Research Initiative. He's also the author of Superintelligence, which was the book that ignited a global conversation about what might happen if AI development goes wrong. In his latest book, Deep Utopia, Bostrom attempts to answer the opposite question: what happens if everything goes right? At such a point of technological maturity, driven by further and further advancements in artificial intelligence, we will confront a challenge that is primarily no longer technological, but philosophical and spiritual in nature. In such a solved world, as Bostrom describes it, what is the point of human existence? What gives life meaning? And how should we spend our days if we no longer need to work, exercise, or make political choices? And is such a world consistent with human agency and freedom? Before we begin to answer these questions, I have a small request to make. If you enjoy this podcast and it brings valuable insights to your life and business, please consider writing us a review and rating the podcast on Apple and Spotify. Each positive review of Hidden Forces helps more people find the show and join our amazing community. And with that, please enjoy this expansive and thought-provoking conversation with my guest, Nick Bostrom. Nick Bostrom, welcome to Hidden Forces.
I'm glad to be with you, Demetri.
I'm excited to have you on, Nick. So I didn't know you were a listener of the podcast. What I was going to tell you is that that's great to hear because you were one of the very first guests that I wanted to have on the show. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get you on because we'd only done a few podcasts. We actually hadn't done any podcasts when I first reached out to you because your book, Superintelligence, which I read in 2015, after first hearing you on a philosophy podcast, where I thought what you had to say was so interesting. Anyway, I got Superintelligence, and it was one of the most influential books that I read at the time. Still the most influential book I've read on AI, at least on AI and existential risk questions. So I had actually wanted to have you on the show from the very beginning. So it's great to hear that you're a listener.
Yeah, no, I'm a big consumer of podcasts and audiobooks, etc.
Yeah. So you have written a different book today. We're here to talk about your book, Deep Utopia. It's kind of, in some sense, I guess, the opposite of Superintelligence. Superintelligence, if I had to kind of summarize it, was a book that looked at the engineering problems of artificial intelligence through a lens of moral philosophy, ethics, so to speak, and epistemology, and how to try and mitigate the risks associated with AI development. Does that sort of summarize what Superintelligence was?
Yeah, it was mainly about what could go wrong and how we might try to avoid it.
And how would you summarize what Deep Utopia is about?
It's kind of what happens if things go right with AI. Now, there's kind of a lot more to it, but that's kind of the core question. Assume we solve the alignment problem and the governance problems and all the ethical problems, and we get kind of the best possible outcome of this transition to the machine intelligence era. And what then would a human life look like? What kind of values could we realize? And that has its own challenges, which kind of, I think, goes quite deep in philosophical terrain. And the book is an attempt to explore that.
So before we get into it, let's introduce you to our audience. How would you describe what you do and the work that you do?
Yeah, I've always had some difficulties finding the right label. I guess philosopher would be a word you could use. But I also have a background. I studied theoretical physics and computational neuroscience and AI and a bunch of other stuff. Until recently, I was a professor at Oxford University, where I was heading the Future of Humanity Institute, which it was founded in 2005 and brought together an interdisciplinary group of people, mathematicians, computer scientists, economists, political scientists, to try to think carefully about big picture questions for the future of human civilization.
So actually, I would love to ask you maybe later if we have time, Why did you guys close down the Future of Humanity Institute? And what are you doing now? Sort of what is next for your career? But the thing is, I've always thought of you as a philosopher. I always imagined that you were primarily a philosopher, that you studied philosophy in school, that was what your PhD was in, and that you turned your gaze towards these engineering problems and artificial intelligence. But that sounds like that's not quite right. So what is your educational background?
Well, I studied a whole bunch of different things at university. I was never really interested in school as a kid, and so I kind of never studied anything as I grew up. But then around 15 years of age, I kind of had this intellectual awakening where I felt I had wasted the first decade and a half of my life, embarked on this program of intense self-study and self-education. But I've never really made a sharp distinction between philosophy and science. To me, they all have seemed part of a continuum where there are like big, interesting questions. And, sometimes there are methods from one discipline or concepts from another that are relevant. This is also what I tried to do with this Future of Humanity Institute, to have a group of people who could pursue the most important questions wherever they led. And maybe you had to kind of chase them, across the field of economics into the field of physics, and then take it, like, depending on where the prey run, you have to kind of follow along. Because I don't think any one discipline has a monopoly on important insights.
Yeah, because when you started the Future of Humanity Institute, your primary focus was not AI, correct? I mean, this was still the period of AI winter, or was it?
Well, it's all along been like a main focus in my thinking. I mean, even long before that, back to the 90s. And in fact, I remember, I think I must have been 17. I was like, at that time in Sweden, where I grew up, we still had conscription. So you had to go in, every 17-year-old male had to go into this army conscription center. And they did a battery of tests over 2 days. And I remember reading this book, Parallel Distributed Processing, which was a book about neural networks, and finding that I had obtained through interlibrary loan. And I was like fascinated with this stuff. And it seemed plausibly sort of on the path towards creating intelligent systems. And then, throughout then, like as a student in London at one point, I studied computational neuroscience and trained a little neural network. This was maybe in 96. So it's been a theme even before I started writing Superintelligence.
What would you say it is that has interested you? What has drawn you to this field? Because it is an interdisciplinary field. You're pulling in philosophy, you're pulling in computer science, neuroscience. So help me understand what the younger Nick Bostrom saw that drew him into this field, or was it just a hard problem and you just attracted to the fact that it was a hard problem? Help me understand what drew you into it.
It has several aspects that makes it attractive to think about. I mean, so one is just computer science and AI in general have a lot of cool concepts and algorithms, and it kind of has thinking tools. Because when you're trying to, especially the good old-fashioned way of doing AI, you had to try to break down a problem into parts and find general ways of solving. So from an kind of gaining intellectual tools perspective, it's a cool field. Then, of course, we ourselves are intelligences, and it's kind of fascinating to understand ourselves as well, which one lens through that is through neuroscience or AI. But those are more theoretical reasons. But I think the most important reason for me was that I thought AI will one day succeed. And at that point, it will change the world, and it will be the last invention we will ever need to make. So the practical impacts of this technology will be greater than of any other technology we've ever developed. And so understanding that as well as possible, maybe one could then nudge it in a positive direction, I think has been the primary motivation for me to focus on that.
Yeah, so you mentioned good old-fashioned AI and the way in which engineers approach the problem of creating artificial intelligence, which relied on explicitly programmed rules and symbolic reasoning, stuff that was more consistent with traditional software engineering practices as we've understood them. How has this approach changed in the last 2 or 3 decades of AI development? And how does that help to explain some of the enormous advancements that we've seen in the field in the last few years?
Well, AI used to be about basically creating large databases of facts and then handcrafting rules of deduction and little clever tricks that you could use to solve particular problems. It often had this kind of slightly logic chopping character where it seemed like a kind of super nerd who was really good with math and logic, but had no intuition, no ability to recognize patterns. And so you could craft these big expert systems. They had very limited utility because they were very fragile. Like if you got one thing wrong, then you could just get everything wrong. And that all changed with the deep learning revolution, which started around 2010, 2012, where neural networks, which had been along all along, they had a little niche, but it hadn't been possible to build them large enough to be useful. But around 2012, we had the hardware to really make big neural networks using initially GPUs, these graphics processing units that had been developed to enable higher resolution graphics in video games. And it turns out those chips were very useful for running neural networks that had this kind of parallel architecture. And so you could get, compared to running these neural networks on a CPU, if you transfer them to a GPU, you got almost 100x faster performance. And once you started doing that around this time, they just were big enough and functioned well enough that you could actually start to do image recognition on images and produce simple images. And that then, like when people saw that could actually work, that attracted a lot of attention. And then people started investing more effort and building bigger computers to run bigger neural networks. And then we've kind of seen continuous progress since then. DeepMind, now Google DeepMind, but at the time it was DeepMind, was a kind of early pioneer of this. I don't know if you recall the Atari playing AI that they developed, which seems so primitive by current standards, but it was an AI system that could learn to play any of a wide range of different Atari games right out of the box without having been specifically constructed to play any one of them. So it had this ability to learn. And then with AlphaGo, so this was another DeepMind project where they built a Go playing AI that defeated Lee Sedol, the human champion at the time. That was really impressive because top-level human Go players have spent basically their whole lives studying these patterns of the Go board and developing deep intuitions. And it's like a deeply strategic game. And there we saw that AIs can have superhuman intuitions and pattern recognition ability, even in a domain where humans have invested like decades of life to perfect their capabilities. And it's kind of been a bullet train since then. Now we have these large language models, which has really brought it home to the general public because you can now talk to AIs and they are starting to have like big economic applications.
What is the key insight or innovation with neural nets that enables them to learn and improve using various training techniques without relying on a formal set of explicitly defined rules?
Yeah, so you have like these neural networks have like a whole bunch of different nodes in the current iteration, maybe hundreds of like billions that are connected. And then each connection has a little weight that you can adjust. So during training, you're basically giving some input. And then if you know what the output is supposed to be, you see what output the AI produces. And then you sort of nudge all of these connections inside a little bit in the direction that would have given a better output. And so if you repeat this, it's called gradient descent, many, many times, then eventually all the weights of these parameters inside a neural network take on values that make the AI tend to generate the kind of output that constitutes a good response to the input. A lot of the heavy lifting here is actually unsupervised learning. So it's not, you don't need a human to give an explicit training signal to work out an example. If you have, for example, a whole bunch of internet text, you could train by just sort of blocking out a little bit of the text, and then from the surrounding text, you can have the AI kind of try to fill in the part that you've blotted out. And then you know the ground truth, right? You can see if what the AI produced matches what was actually there. So just learning to predict internet text is kind of the main part of training these large language models. And then you can do a little bit of fine-tuning on top, where maybe you have a human rate different answers and stuff. But that's like the kind of the coat of paint applied to the main structure, which is unsupervised learning.
So I may or may not have mentioned the date that you published Superintelligence. That was in 2014. I read it in 2015. The world was a very different place then. And the challenges and risks of AI development that you put forward in the book, while sobering, still felt very remote. Conversations about AI risk and the perception of the immediacy of some of those risks have changed quite a bit since then. What is your perception of how the AI landscape and conversations about AI have changed since you first published the book 10 years ago?
It's been a huge change. Yeah, I mean, back then, and the book was in the works for 6 years before it came out. Yeah, the whole question about the future of AI or superintelligence, let alone like the alignment problem, was completely neglected by academia. So nobody else was interested in that. It was kind of, science fiction, futurism, whatever, you guys. So that's obviously changed. Right now, all the frontier AI labs have research groups focusing specifically on trying to solve the alignment problem. And in the last couple of years, we've also seen a big shift in public discourse around this, where in fact, like world leaders are now putting out statements on transformative AI. We have had various documents coming out from the White House, like the UK had this global summit on AI last year. EU has had a bunch of documents and events on this as well. And so it's been quite remarkable just to see how something that went from being far outside the Overton window has just over a decade kind of come in and now is right smack in the middle of it.
Has the field progressed faster than you expected?
I think it's been on the shorter end of the distribution of scenarios. Like within distribution, it's not that surprising, but maybe kind of in the fastest 25% of the probability distribution, if you had asked me back in 2014.
How closely do you follow the progress that's being made at companies like OpenAI? And do you have an opinion on whether or not they have the right protocols in place and the right corporate cultures to navigate the challenges that you assessed in that book?
Yeah, so we don't know exactly how difficult the problem will turn out to be of aligning superintelligences to the goals or intentions of their builders. This is a technical problem, and obviously we've never built any superintelligences before, so we don't kind of have a large statistical data set that we could use to estimate the difficulty level. So I think probably relative to what one might have expected, I think there has been more effort into solving the alignment problem, and the leading labs are more aware of it than one might have anticipated. Like both OpenAI, Google DeepMind, and Anthropic, perhaps especially, the key people there have for a long time been talking about transformative AI and the risks and the social impacts, and much more than other big tech corporate leaders normally would be expected to do. Now, whether that would be sufficient is a lot harder to say. But I think if there are two components in our uncertainty about whether we will succeed, and one component is how hard is the problem intrinsically that we have to solve, and the other part of the uncertainty is like to what degree will we get our act together and make an inspired effort. I think most of the uncertainty is in the former category as to how hard the problem actually is.
So it was recently announced that the leaders of OpenAI's super alignment team were departing the company. This comes after we'd already seen open conflict between factions within OpenAI that were more concerned with AI safety, including the OpenAI board, and those focused on speeding up commercialization, led most prominently by the company's CEO, Sam Altman. Are you concerned about similar internal divisions at other companies and the industry's ability overall to mitigate risks in an environment where all these different companies and different countries even might be incentivized to move fast and break things?
Yeah, it's not great. I think we might see more as the kind of importance of this technology increases. I think there will be growing pressures on these people trying to do the work, like will become more politically contentious, geopolitically contentious, vast economic forces will start to bear. And so it's going to be a very hard job to be ahead of one of these AI labs and try to sort of navigate on these stormy seas with wind blowing in all directions. And I think it's like inevitable that you won't be able to make everybody happy all the time. But I think we have to kind of grade on a curve here a little bit and sort of try to, when some lab or some group does something that is, even if not ideal, but a little bit better than the others are doing or than what we would have expected, then like maybe praise that. And then over time, maybe we can kind of raise the bar as to what we expect from these AI labs. But if you require perfection at the outset, it might just discourage any of the labs from even trying to do anything about AI safety and instead adopt a more dismissive approach, as some of the other large tech companies working on AI have tended to do.
So let's talk about Deep Utopia. As I mentioned, that's the name of the book, Deep Utopia. The subtitle is Life and Meaning in a Solved World. What is a solved world?
I mean a world in which two things are true. One is that we've achieved technological maturity, meaning all those technologies that we even currently have good reason to think are physically possible, and for which there is some possible developmental pathway from where we are now to these technologies, have been developed. Or if not perfect technological maturity, at least some good enough approximation to that. So you would have advanced AIs, robotics, you would have all the kind of technologies that these AIs could quickly develop, perhaps like cures for aging, the ability to upload brains into computers, all kinds of stuff. So that's the first part of solved world. The other is that we imagine that governance problems are solved to whatever extent they can be solved. So to the extent that some forms of government are better than others, let's assume we get like one of the best ones. And so then, yeah, you do have this situation where a lot of practical problems that we currently have to struggle with as human beings would go away. Either they wouldn't exist anymore, or, I mean, at least if there still are practical problems that have to be solved, then they would be more efficiently solved by AIs. And so human beings would not have any of these practical problems to deal with.
Does a solved world also imply a complete and total understanding of everything, of the universe and everything in it?
It doesn't imply it. And I think it depends a little on what you mean by everything. I do believe that one of the things that might happen gradually if human civilization lasts for long enough and happen much faster if we have super intelligent AIs to do the research is that we discover most of the really important central facts about the universe. And then there's still more truth to unearth, but there will be kind of concerning smaller and smaller details. So you could only discover the true laws of physics once, right? And then after that, maybe you could eventually be reduced to study the details of the gut flora of some particular beetle in the Amazon forest and like smaller and smaller details.
Well, what I'm trying to ask is, does a solved world convey the promise of a type of deterministic understanding of the universe akin to Laplace's demon, where everything becomes knowable, not just our understanding of the past and the present, but also the future?
Well, it's not meant to express that there is some great equation that allows us to predict, like to actually instantiate Laplace's demon. It might just be impossible in our universe to have a computer that's big enough to sort of compute everything that will happen later in the universe. I think you could build specific systems that would be deterministic. For example, if you upload a human mind to a computer and then run that human mind interacting with a virtual reality, both the upload itself and the virtual reality could be these deterministic programs. And then it would be possible from the outside to predict what would happen. For example, you could run it once, record what happens, and then whenever you run this human mind again in the same virtual environment, exactly the same thing will happen. So you could create little deterministic domains like that you would have perfect predictability of, but not more generally. There would still be chaos, like you wouldn't be able necessarily to predict the weather a year from now and other such chaotic systems.
So what is the spectrum of time over which we are likely to achieve technological maturity in your view? So what is the bounded distribution of possibilities here we're talking about?
Yeah, unfortunately, the bounds are quite wide. So first, we need to get sort of fully human level AGI. And so it seems to be going pretty fast at the moment. But assuming we get to there, then you need superintelligence from there. I think that will go pretty fast as well. Now, then once you have machine superintelligence, like AI scientists that can do AI research on digital timescales rather than biological timescales, then I think technological maturity or at least some decent approximation to that might follow pretty quickly. And I don't know whether it would take like months or decades, but certainly on a kind of astronomical timescale, it would be like the blink of an eye, I think.
Can we define these terms, like what is human level AGI and how does it differ from superintelligence?
Yeah, so as you zoom in, and now, like given the recent technological developments, it becomes more important to zoom in. Like, so what from a distance appears like a dot like as you get closer, you see it actually has structures. So yeah, so human level AGI is kind of a rough concept that maybe you're right. Perhaps we need to start to abandon now as we can sort of see more specifically ways in which AI systems are kind of superior to us in some respects and still not quite there in others. But you could think of it, I guess, as an AI that would be able to do all intellectual work that the human can do, at least as well and at least as fast, given similar input on the job as a human has. And superintelligence would be, I guess, something that is just like a lot smarter than that and a lot smarter than any human who has ever lived, let's say. So there are like in science fiction, like they like all these kind of futuristic technologies that space, like you have the Star Wars, like a space settlement, travel through space, like cures for aging. You could imagine perfect virtual realities and like nanotechnology that could sort of shift objects. Like all these technologies that we can imagine that we see are like they don't violate any law of physics. And probably if humans were just hacking away on them, like for 20,000 years, we probably would have space settlements and aging therapies and all of the rest, right? And so there could be then this telescoping of the future. Once you have superintelligence doing the research, all of these developments that might take tens of thousands of years for humans to do could potentially happen much, much more quickly. And then you would get this technological maturity. In principle, you could bracket the question of how long it will take. Like the ultimate questions are the same anyway, but I do think it adds a little bit of urgency to it. If you think there is some realistic prospect, this could actually happen within the lifetime of many of us, perhaps, if we get this machine intelligence revolution over the next years or decades.
So one of the things that has concerned me since I first started learning about these problems was the problem of control. And I'm not even talking about just the AI control problem. I'm actually talking more specifically about the more immediate issues of control and power that come from humans, certain humans having access to these technologies, and also the way in which these technologies, this AI, so to speak, the suite of technologies that create what we call AI, change the incentive structures of our economies and our political systems. And one of the questions that I have for you is that on the way toward technological maturity, what happens to governments? What happens to the incentives that govern the political arrangements of our societies and our economies? And how does that manifest in terms of the rights of individuals, their well-being, etc.?
The short answer is I don't know. It seems plausible. There could be a lot of turbulence there as we are sort of starting to tweak the basic knobs and parameters of sort of the human communication system. And we know historically that when you've changed some of these basic parameters, big political changes have ensued. So with the invention of writing, you have the rise of states that you could keep tax records and you could then administer like larger political entities. Then we see with the printing press, we have first kind of religious wars of persecution when everybody starts to develop their own interpretation of the Holy Book, and then later democracy becomes possible. You can have newspapers and stuff, and widespread literacy. And then more recently with the internet, it seems again we are experiencing significant cultural and political impacts from that. We are kind of in the midst of it, so it's not really clear how it shakes out, but it does seem like social media, etc., is having some kind of impact on our public discourse and our political dynamics. And possibly AI tools will, again, randomize some of these elements. And so you could imagine different scenarios where maybe it becomes more easy to centralize power. Right now, if you're a dictator, you need to get the buy-in of some significant portion of the population. Like at the minimum, your security forces and like the military need to support you. You can't just sit on your own in your room with absolutely no friends and still govern. So with AI tools, maybe you could automate a lot of this security apparatus, and it would be possible for a much smaller governing coalition to govern without the consent of the rest. Then other things like automated censorship tools, sentiment analysis tools, you would be able to maybe form a very granular view of what the opinions and intentions of every member of the population is. right? I mean, it's been possible to record everybody's conversations for a couple of decades and everybody's text messages, but you haven't been able to do that much with it until there is a specific person of interest, like a political opponent. And then you can dig through all that they have said or done and try to find some dirt or some crime. But with AI tools doing this, you could sort of do that for everybody all the time and have a kind of system that incentivizes everybody to the degree to which they endorse the reigning orthodoxy or praise the regime or such like. And then you could also have like automated, individualized propaganda bots that kind of customize messages for each individual to touch all of their biases in exactly the right way, and other things like that as well. And so it's plausible that when you introduce all of these things, it will kind of result in different political equilibria. And maybe they are better or maybe they are worse. We don't really have the political science that can predict these things very well, but it seems likely that they will change it in some way or another.
So let's dig into that a little bit, because I would say that the communication revolutions of the last 500 years have been largely a decentralizing force. There has been some element of centralization, but the invention of the printing press, the telegraph, and broadcast, well, let's put aside broadcast technologies, the invention of the telegraph, the telephone, and the internet have largely been sources of decentralization. The Industrial Revolution, I would argue, has been a centralizing force, in part because it diminished the power of labor. And so we came to a political settlements in Western countries around how to manage that changing power dynamic. What I wonder about is whether or not AI will be a decentralizing or a centralizing force. It seems to me that it's a centralizing force, unless, again, we come to some kind of political settlement, which then raises the question of, can we think about the path through which we will find some kind of political settlement in democratic societies? Because ultimately, the ability to have a democratic consensus depends on the empowerment of individuals in the society. So, like, where do you come down on that? Do you think AI will ultimately be a centralizing force, or will it allow for more decentralization in human societies?
Yeah, I think we might have to distinguish two senses of centralizing. So I think some of these earlier technologies you mentioned, in some sense, have been centralizing in that they enable the center to have more insight and control over what goes on in the periphery. So like if you're like an empire and you can send telegraphs out to all your different colonies and stuff, it makes it easier for your central administration to control what is going on in the periphery. So that's one sense in which I think technology has strengthened the ability of the center to control the periphery. But I think also it has made it at least possible to have political systems where the center in turn is controlled by a broader set of actors, including ones at the periphery. So with democratic systems, you can sort of distribute power throughout the nation and allow each person to like read newspapers or find information about what's going on all over the place and then kind of mail in or travel or locally submit their ballot or otherwise shape what is going on in the center. So I think like centralization could mean either that the center more controls what is going on in the periphery, but there is also this question of the degree to which the periphery controls what is going on in the center. And so I think theoretically AI could increase both of these abilities. So yes, the center would have a much better ability to control what is going on. I mean, it used to be the case, right? The mountains are tall and the emperor is far away. And I think that the mountains will be less tall and the emperor will be closer already with current communications technologies, but even more with AI. But it might also mean that equilibria are possible where more people are able to keep tabs on what is going on in the centers of power. Like, for example, you could imagine if each person has a kind of AI representative who is advocating on their behalf, who learns a lot about their preferences and is continuously expressing those and lobbying for them, the way that right now some people can pay for lobbyists or corporations might be able to hire. But for most people, they don't have the time maybe to keep track of every detailed technical issue and to scrutinize every legislative proposal draft text, right? The average person just doesn't have the bandwidth for that. And with AI, you could imagine that they would kind of be able to express their preferences better and learn better and have various. So certainly the center could have more control over the periphery, but I think then it depends on which political system you have, where maybe there are two possible equilibria, where either the center just controls the periphery and the periphery doesn't have any ability to control the center, or in a different equilibrium, maybe the center is very strong, but it is in turn controlled by a wide range of different constituencies.
Yeah, I have a friend that was recently telling me either about a story they heard or someone who actually did this that they knew, but they used a bot, an AI, to communicate with an AI customer service bot. And this is something I've heard. I mean, this is an example of something that I've heard people discuss as something that is going to happen sooner rather than later. And that's obviously very liberating. That's, I think, an example of many of the ways in which this can really improve our lives. Another topic, again, now this is sort of like moving us back into the subject of deep utopia. Another topic that you talk about in the book is something that has been broadly discussed over the years with respect to AI, which is, for lack of a better term, mass unemployment. The people losing their jobs. And you make a really good point, which is that the way we think about job loss is typically negative in that people lose their jobs while most are gainfully employed. But in the kind of future you're talking about, our entire conception of work would be different. So what do you think work would look like, or people's relationship to what we think of as work or employment in a solved world?
The goal of AI is full unemployment. I think what AI has always been trying to do is to figure out ways to automate not just specific tasks, but ideally all tasks. And once you can do that, there's no more jobs that need to be done. Now, so I think we will get to an approximation of that with some important carve-outs, mainly in cases where consumers have a direct preference, not just concerning the product, but concerning how the product is produced. So right now, sometimes maybe somebody is willing to pay extra for a trinket if it was made by some favored group or maybe by some like indigenous craft person, as opposed to produced by a sweatshop, somewhere far away. Even if the actual trinket is kind of indistinguishable, like a little butter knife or something, right? You might just care about how it was produced and be willing to pay more for that. Or other cases, like if there's like some running performance or boxing performance, even if robots could run faster and box harder, people might just prefer to watch it being done by humans. So those would be niches where even at technological maturity, there could remain work for humans. But for, I think, all functionally defined tasks, it will ultimately be done better and cheaper and more efficiently by AIs and robots.
Would you say that we're already seeing this? Like we're seeing this in the example of the laying down problem in China, or the anti-work movement in America, or the opioid epidemic? I mean, now that speaks to, the depression, anxiety, the rising rates of depression, anxiety, also speak to the questions of purpose in a solved world. Would you say that we're already beginning to see the effects of all this?
I'm not sure. I'd imagine today the labor market is still mostly influenced by other factors than by AI, like the degree to which outsource, like whether the economy is booming or contracting, the flexibility of the labor market, like these kinds of things that have always buffeted sort of the labor market and affected the unemployment rate. I think it's possible that we are like soon, either now or soon, going to start see the impact of AI. I mean, certainly within specific niches, like, I don't know, like customer service representative or like other particular, I think, kind of legal research assistant whose like job it is to dig through a library of legal precedents to try to pick out relevant ones. I think those are tasks where already AI systems seem perfectly capable of matching human performance. And there will be more and more of these. But I don't know whether, like, if you look at the aggregate level of unemployment right now, I would attribute much of that to AI.
Yeah. Well, not to AI, but I guess what I'm getting at is the technological progress, of which AI and superintelligence is a kind of culminating point. This is the context in which I was bringing it up. Another area that I'm excited about is education, because I have felt for a long time that university, I mean, I'm not alone in this, lots of people feel this way, that education, specifically college education, has become so expensive that it just doesn't justify itself in almost most cases. Most of what you're doing is you're getting a piece of paper that signals your value that you could then use to get jobs. You're also exposed to a network of people that can help advance your career. And then also in younger demographics, K through 12, where granted the cost to benefit ratio for parents sending their kids to school is more justifiable, the opportunities for advanced learning that don't involve sitting in a classroom or learning at a common pace or using the same template are, I think, growing even more rapidly and appear very promising, it seems to me. What do you think learning will look like? And how soon could this fundamentally change our educational systems, which are largely bureaucratic and industrial in their formulations?
Yeah, I think it's ripe for reform. If you kind of imagine like the way that we currently look back on earlier generations and ages and see how like barbaric their practices were in different ways and how unethical. Like we say, oh, these people kept slaves, that's horrible. These people just invaded other nations willy-nilly without any justification. They kept women at home, like all the kind of moral horrors that we now shudder at. And we think how future generations might view us. And like if we have to guess at various things that they would object to about current civilization, then I think like obviously the way we treat animals is one, but perhaps also the way we educate children, like kind of send them away to these institution schools where they sit at desks and get assigned tasks, for 9, 10, 12 years, in order then to get some kind of quality stamp at the end. It seems like, especially in these scenarios where AI automates human labor, that's definitely one of the first things one would want to rethink. But even short of that, I think just availing oneself of the possibility of individualized tutor systems would seem quite exciting. But I mean, I guess there's a lot of inertia in the education system. So it might well be that we have the singularity before we actually have some kind of thoroughgoing educational reform.
By the singularity, you mean the passing the threshold into superintelligence?
Yeah.
Why would that come first? And why is that important?
I'm just observing that like there are various social institutions that seem quite immune to change. Our healthcare system, our education system, not to mention the university system.
Well, wouldn't that just mean that these institutions would become irrelevant?
Yeah, but a lot of things will become irrelevant once you have superintelligence. So depending on your timescales.
Well, I mean that they would become irrelevant before superintelligence. I mean that I see this in my own world in podcasting. Forget AI. I see how many people are able to use the tools that are currently available to drastically improve their knowledge base. And we're not even talking about AI assistance yet. So I could imagine that in 5 or 10 years, the education landscape could be fundamentally different. I'm not saying, I don't know how that would translate into university systems or K through 12 school systems changing in order to try and compete, but just in terms of what people can do on their own. That's what I'm suggesting.
Yeah, I think definitely what people could do on their own will change a lot in 5 or 10 years. In fact, I think even has changed. I mean, what could you not do alone if you were a motivated kid just using ChatGPT 3 or 4 and Google and the Khan Academy? I think you could cover your whole educational curriculum perfectly well, and then you could go out and play sports or socialize with other kids in different settings. So I think that's definitely possible, but whether that will actually be what the mainstream educational experience will be like in 5 or 10 years, I kind of doubt it. I think there will be little elements of this introduced, but probably people will still send their kids to sit in classrooms for the next 5 or 10 years.
So another thing that you explore in the book is what will we value in a world where solving things, the pleasure that comes from solving things is gone. And one of my questions for you is that in such a world where, let's say, more and more of the problems that we confront are solved more efficiently by the systems that we employ rather than our own minds, does that imply that in such a world, the relative value of experiences and socializing with other people increases? Is that a place where you could imagine we would spend more of our time and more of our money in a solved world?
Potentially, yeah. I think things related to the various entanglements and complications that arise from the fact that we are social creatures could occupy a larger portion of our time, attention, and budgets. I think if we think through what it really would mean to live in a solved world, I think realize we have to go back to the basics, really rethink our values from the ground up to consider what kind of worthwhile existence would actually make sense in a solved world. There are so many things we just take for granted because of all the instrumental necessities to which we have been subject and every previous human generation has been subject. When they drop away, we really face this potential purpose problem. Like, what would give purpose and meaning and significance to a life lived in a solved world? What would we do all day long? And that's what the book really tries to dig into.
So I think one of the things that, so to that point about purpose, one of the things that dictators always invest in is sports. And it's a way of keeping people occupied. And I could imagine that in such a world, competition and sort of controlled settings in which people could compete in various games would become a source of meaning. You kind of do explore that in the book, but you don't necessarily express it in that way. Does that resonate with you? Is that something that you could imagine that people, whether it's sports or something else, people will want to spend more and more, again, they will be socializing more, spending more time with other people, and also will be able to find meaning by competing with other people, because obviously competing against machines wouldn't really be really great. And I feel like we've kind of seen that. I mean, we've seen that, for example, in chess or in video games writ large, which, humans are not able to compete with machines. Like you can't, in the most difficult settings of a lot of video games, you just can't compete with the computer. But people still play those games. They just play them with other people, and they find a lot of meaning in doing so. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, I think games could be an increasingly important part of the future. I mean, you mentioned spending more time socializing with other people. I think it's a bit of an open question whether that will actually happen. It certainly could happen, and maybe it would seem attractive from our point of view if it does happen, but be increasingly compelling AI companions that will vie for our attention. And it's, I think, an open question of what, like in kind of reflective equilibrium, people will choose in that respect. Whether to spend a lot of time with kind of flawed human beings with their good parts and their bad parts, and sometimes they're kind of annoying and tedious, and sometimes they are lovely, but it's a mixed bag, or to have this kind of much more highly optimized kind of super stimulus of the virtual companion. So right now can have various opinions about that, but we are also speaking from a position of ignorance. They're not yet being these very sophisticated social companions. I wonder if it will be one of these generational things where kind of the old folks like us will think, oh, it's much more important. You need to connect with real people. That's like, and then the younger generations think like, oh, we're not getting it. Like they're so stuck in their way, like having to socialize
with. Isn't that true though? So this is a really interesting opportunity to exercise some judgment, because I feel like this conversation, well, I don't mean our conversation, I mean the conversation around AI has been morally relative or relativistic. And I wonder if that is appropriate, because it seems to me that the world that we're describing, a world where, let's say one version of that world, where people are siloed in their own ecosystems, their own universes, really, and they're not socializing with other people, they're socializing with machines, and machines that are in some ways really just mirrors, right? I mean, in some ways, AI is like a giant mirror. And I wonder, in that type of a world, don't people just end up becoming lost and moving further? I mean, if the world we live in today, that we've evolved to live in, gives us an opportunity to be in contact in various ways, whether it's through meditative states or through states of deep suffering, in closer contact with reality or the real world or truth, and moving into this world takes us away from that, is what we're embarking on, in a sense, just something that will cause us to lose ourselves or lose our humanity? I mean, is it something that we can talk about in relative terms, or is there really a moral judgment that should be made here before we embark on it?
Certainly, I think there are a lot of moral judgments that should be made. The difficulty is like making them in a way that reflects more than, our idiosyncratic personality or the currently received wisdom or your mood at the time. To actually reach down and kind of ground these moral judgments in some underlying bedrock is a very difficult exercise, if it's possible at all. But we could think about some of these questions. I think one has to kind of go slow, to pick one particular of these questions and then ponder it a little bit. So this idea of being in contact with reality, I think could take many forms because there are many different parts of reality, and which ones do you want to be most in contact with? You could say that the cultural artifacts that we build are also part of reality. And right now we live mostly in that part of reality. I mean, you could, I guess, go out and spend time in the wilderness, and some people do that, but most of us, most of the time, live in a world of buildings and books and TV shows and internet forums and scientific papers and, bank statements and like all of these. These are real, but they are sort of humanly constructed. And I'm not sure whether that's like an inferior part of reality. Like as a general rule, I think like some bits of it are bad, but then some bits of nature is maybe also not so great. So would your contention be that there is like the natural parts of reality, or it's better to be in touch with those than to be in touch with the like socially constructed parts? Or
well, I mean, obviously, and then to go back to pull from your previous work on the simulation theory, we don't know. We don't know anything. I mean, fundamentally, we don't know whether what we're experiencing right now is reality. All of it could be a simulation.
So that's true. Like it might be that in some sense, everything is an artifact if we are in a simulation.
Yes, to your point, I've thought about this because there's literature. People have written about this during the course of the Industrial Revolution. But I could imagine that man in his sort of most elemental state, and I don't mean hunting and gathering, but maybe in a slightly civilized society, but pre-industrial revolution might have been the ideal state for people. And that what we're moving toward is a world increasingly where people just lose touch with their humanity. And maybe there's something more important and something that's more elemental to who we are that makes life worth living in a more sort of natural state than the world we're going into. And maybe what we're doing is whether human beings survive or whatever we're going to become, whether we survive or not, maybe that's really irrelevant. And maybe what we're doing is we're moving away from something profoundly mysterious and real and towards something that our more pious ancestors would intuitively identify or call out as demonic. And that what's really at stake here are our souls. And that creating superintelligence and trying to merge with it is a cascade into hell.
Yeah, but I think, again, there are so many things rolled into one there. So, I mean, the idea that the agriculturalist existence, primitive agriculturalist, is the most natural form for humanity. Maybe that's true, but we spend a lot more time being hunter-gatherers. And I think to hunter-gatherer society, the idea of being fixed in one plot and kind of growing one kind of food and living in one kind of, like, that was a very unnatural existence. And then the states that the agriculturalist societies developed, the hierarchical nature of society, maybe the more clearly defined gender roles, taxation, the monotony of existence of an agriculturalist relative to a hunter-gatherer, the regimented nature of work often. All of these things, I think, seemed quite alien and unnatural to the hunter-gatherer type of life that like is really more than 9/10 of our species' existence. So we are, we might have evolved a little bit during the kind of era that we were agriculturalists, but I think only imperfectly adapted to that. And I think one shouldn't also romanticize the actual existence of agriculturalists for the last several thousand years. If you look at it, they had like all the symptoms of a bad life. The kind of they're short in stature, stunted in various ways, bad teeth, like no dentistry, obviously, no opportunities for like education or for choosing your profession, or in many cases, not for choosing your marriage partner. You just kind of born into one place. You have only one option, and you're living a subsistence level life where, like, you can't properly feed your kids. You have to work every day, maybe from morning till late in the afternoon, even when your body is tired, and then you die, and there is no anesthesia to palliate your last months, and like, you can't kick back in the evening watching Netflix, like it's just dark, and you have to creep into your flea-infested straw mattress. So I wouldn't exchange that kind of life for like an average human life today, but your mileage might vary.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point, and I don't want to idealize it. We've been freed of an enormous amount of suffering, and in some sense, the way I think about technological progress, or the drive for technological progress, is it's a drive for ease. Like, the incentive is to make things easier, and reduction of suffering is also falls in that category. It's a derivative of making things easier. The other thing I think about is whether or not human beings can exist in a world without external constraints. We still live in a world with external constraints, but the world that you're describing is a world where the constraints will be imposed on us either by human beings who control these technologies or the technology itself, almost like we live in this kind of parasitic existence where we're parasites relative to some superintelligence. Do you ever think about that we don't have the mental constitution to exist in this kind of a dynamic?
Yeah, that's a core part of the challenge here. It's like, I have this metaphor of a little insect that has like an exoskeleton, right? That holds the soft, squishy parts together. And similarly, I think the human soul is has an exoskeleton of instrumental necessities, all these things that we have to do to get through life. You have to go into work to make a living. You have to brush your teeth to make sure your gum doesn't rot. You have to pick up the kids from school because somebody has to pick them up. You have to do this, you have to do that. Our lives are so conditioned by the fact of all these things that we have to do. And it's always been like that since the human species first arose. But if we do end up in this condition, I call it a condition of post-instrumentality. It would maybe be a little bit like taking away the exoskeleton from the insect. And if you take away this exoskeleton of instrumental necessities, what becomes of the human soul and human life? Can it still retain shape and structure, or does it just become a kind of contented pleasure blob that is enjoying some super drug or some direct brain manipulation of nucleus accumbens and experiencing great pleasure perhaps, but with very little else going on? I think ultimately that could constitute the life of these inhabitants of the solved world. Although incidentally, I think we shouldn't be too quick to dismiss this pleasure blob possibility. I think it's like easy to poo-poo that without having like ever experienced it, and like our opinions will seem very naive to the people who actually will have had the opportunity to try it out. But nonetheless, I think one could have a future life of enormous pleasure and bliss, but also with other elements added to that to make it even more appealing.
I think maybe the bigger issue is not the absolute change that we're going to experience, but the relative change with respect to how quickly it comes. If you read accounts of native tribes in the Americas, or I can think of some specific ones like the subjugation of various Latin American societies, they fell into depression and alcoholism because the world that they inhabited, their gods and their way of life, collapsed so quickly. And they were pushed into an agricultural system that they just simply were not adapted to. They didn't have the time to really adapt. And I wonder if the speed with which the changes are happening today is going to introduce a similar dynamic in our current societies. Do you ever think about that?
Yeah, but it certainly is a possibility, but it could also go the other way around, I think. I mean, one of the elements here of this picture of a solved world that we need to bring in is like, so we talked a little bit earlier about unemployment, right? Like, so the machines could do economic labor that better than we can do. That's kind of the outermost layer of the onion. So yeah, people will have fewer jobs, maybe no jobs at all. But there are a lot of people today who don't have to work for a living, who still seem to have great lives in many cases, like children don't do any economically useful work mostly, and they still seem to have great existences. Some retired people, if they are in great health, seem to have good lives. There are people of independent means, like wealthy people who don't have to work for a living. Sometimes they have great life. But that's kind of level one, right? Then you have this more radical conception of a post-instrumental, not just a post-work, but a post-instrumental condition where a lot of other things that people currently do in their leisure would also go away.
Are people still going to have sex?
Well,
I mean, what does dating look like in this world? Again, this is something else that's also changed. Again, we're not talking about AI, but we've seen with technological innovation, and there are other sort of economic explanations as well that might go into it, but we've seen there's some studies that have come out, or data or surveys that show that younger people are having less sex, or they're less interested in sex. And that might be because they have more ready access to technology and stuff like that, where they're able to live in kind of their own world and satisfy those needs in indirect or sort of virtual ways.
Yeah. So there's this bunch of activities that we do because we have to, not to make money, but for other reasons, like that you have to brush your teeth. Like even Bill Gates has to brush his teeth, right? Or he gets tooth decay. And some people enjoy to do various things because they bring some benefits. So maybe somebody likes to go shopping. I don't quite understand it, but it's like a common pastime some people enjoy, right? But if you imagine this scenario where the result of this instrumental activity of going shopping is that you end up with something worse than you would have if you had just let your AI recommender system pick out and buy the stuff for you, then there's a kind of maybe a question mark over this activity. You could still maybe go shopping, but it would seem pointless. And you can go through the activities that we fill our days with when we don't have to work and start to cross them out, or at least put question marks on top of it, in this post-instrumental condition where AIs and robots could do all of these tasks better than you could do. So that's kind of the second layer of the onion, if you want. Then there's a layer that seems to, at first sight, remain. So if you want to be fit, right, you have to exercise. And you can't really hire a robot to go and run on the treadmill on your behalf. So you might think, well, that would be then an example of the kind of activity that would still make sense in a solved world. But amongst the technological affordances would also be the ability to achieve the same effects that exercise has without actually exercising. So you could pop a pill that would induce the same muscle growth and cardio tuning and whatever the psychological mellowness that some people get after a good workout, without ever moving away from the couch. And so in that scenario, would it still make sense to spend an hour sweating at the gym and you could just pop the pill and achieve the same effect? And one example of this, I call this third level a plastic world. You have a condition of plasticity where ourselves, our bodies and minds and mental states become completely malleable, something we can choose. So that would be the technological affordances to sort of take shortcuts to directly change your body and mind into whatever state you prefer. And this puts a question mark on all the things we currently do in order to have fun. So you might, somebody might play a game of golf in order to experience subjective pleasure because they enjoy the game. And the only way they can have that pleasure is by actually going out on the golf course. But here you would have the ability to take a pill that would give you the same amount of pleasure without access to a golf course, or analogously for other things that people do for the pleasure of it. So those activities also, it seems, would be crossed out, or at least have this question mark of pointlessness placed over them. And that, then gives us this big challenge of how to conceive of a life. Like, what would it actually still make sense to do? What would constitute a good life in this condition of a solved world?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to imagine, because the state of the world in the phase of technological maturity is so alien to where we are today. Even though, as I said, there are certain trends or trajectories that do seem like we've already embarked on them. In closing, Nick, my last question is, what advice do you give people who learn about what you do and are concerned or anxious about this future, what advice do you have to give them for what they can do in their personal lives? Are there ways in which they can become, for example, people are concerned about their careers, about their work. Is there some advice you give for a student who's looking to, pick a major in college, or someone who's looking to embark on a career early on in their lives and they're trying to figure out what the best way to go about it is given these technological trends? What do you tell people?
So the goal here is to sort of benefit themselves as opposed to like saving the world, or?
Well, they may maybe that's the appropriate place to sort of find a purpose for their lives. But my point really being is how to think about their role in the world given these changes.
Yeah, so I don't think I have any very strong, I think there are like some weak recommendations perhaps that would apply to many people. So, one might be to kind of familiarize oneself with the current level of AI tools, and, one might be an early adopter and get some benefit in that way. And another might be to enjoy life now and do the things that a human existence can provide opportunities for doing that you want to do now, rather than like putting it off for 20 years, given that there's more uncertainty about how many years there will be in this human condition. So in particular for children, I think like we shouldn't just think of childhood as a way to prepare people to become productive and useful adults, but also like a period of time when you can enjoy being a child. And like sometimes children are better at squeezing enjoyment out of lives than adults are. And so do the most of that. I think it makes sense to hedge your bet, still learn the basic skills, like in case this transition takes longer. You wouldn't want to end up finding yourself 20 with like no preparation for getting on in the world. But I think like at least adding more kind of enjoyment in the here and now to your life portfolio. Maybe having some savings invested in relevant equities to hedge against scenarios where like there is not massive redistribution and some of these like AI companies become very valuable. It might be good to have some exposure to that. Yeah, and then that kind of maybe, it's interesting to follow along these developments, learning a little bit about the technology, the AI companies and the key players and views, because it is like, the main show in town at the moment in the world, it seems, like going on in the background. And so it seems like weird to be alive at this most unique point in all of human history and not even pay attention.
Yeah.
Like it's like being, in Paris during the French Revolution and paying absolutely no attention to what is going on and just focusing on your little garden. You could do that, but it does seem like if we look back on other, like sometimes people on podcasts get asked like, oh, if you could go back to any other place and time in history, which one would you pick? And then they usually pick some really interesting, eventful place, like Athens or like the Scottish Enlightenment or, like some big, but like most people maybe now are living in something that is far more interesting and exciting than any of those moments, but many are not really paying any attention to it.
That's a very interesting way of putting it, actually. Yeah. Ironically, this could be the most consequential period in human history and the most interesting and the most full of change. And yet, oftentimes we find ourselves fantasizing about going and living in some other period. Maybe because we know the outcome. Maybe because we already know what's going to happen and it's a controlled experiment. Whereas now, the future is full of both utopias and dystopias.
Yeah.
Well, Nick, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It was great speaking with you. As I mentioned, the title of your latest book is Deep Utopia, Life and Meaning in a Solved World, and it has been out for, I believe, a month almost now. Is that right?
Something like that.
Yeah. So people can get it. There's no audiobook, right? Are you going to be releasing an audiobook for this?
Yeah, it's in the works. So hopefully it should happen in, I don't know, it might take another couple of months or something, but it's being recorded.
Well, congratulations again, and thank you so much for coming on the show, Nick.
Oh, it was fun to talk to you.
If you want to listen in on the rest of today's conversation, head over to hiddenforces.io/subscribe and join our premium feed. If you want to join in on the conversation and become a member of the Hidden Forces Genius community, you can also do that through our subscriber page. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. You can follow me on Twitter @Kofinas, and you can email me at info@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.